The village of Ilra had returned to its usual quiet rhythm after Elaina and Kale's terrifying ordeal in the shadowed forest. But for Elaina, the forest still loomed in her mind, its dark presence a constant weight. Every creak of the wind through the trees reminded her of what they had escaped. Kale, though visibly shaken, seemed to recover quickly. He began to talk again about their parents, about the voices he had heard in the forest. They weren't like the shadows, he insisted one evening, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a lingering fear. Elaina wanted to dismiss the idea, to reassure Kale that their parents were gone, beyond the reach of this world. But the truth was, she wasn't sure. The forest didn't obey the natural laws of life and death. Its shadows had worn her mother's face and spoken her words. Elaina knew she couldn't ignore the forest any longer. What they had experienced was only the beginning, and the shadow hunters weren't going to stop. They had tried to claim Kale, and they would try again. She needed answers about the curse that bound it to their village. Late one night, while Kale slept fitfully in his bed, Elaina lit the old lantern and sat at the table with her thoughts. She remembered the faint whispers she had heard in the forest, the way the shadows seemed drawn to the light, but unable to touch it. The next morning, Elaina visited the home of Elder Merrick, the oldest and most knowledgeable person in the village. Merrick was a recluse, rarely seen outside his small, crooked house at the edge of Ilra. His presence alone made people uneasy. "Elaina," he said when he opened the door, his voice gravelly but warm. "It's not often I get visitors. Come in." Elaina stepped inside, clutching the lantern tightly. Marek's home was cluttered with books, strange trinkets, and jars filled with herbs. "What brings you here?" he asked, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated before speaking. "It's about the forest," she said finally, "and the shadow hunters." At the mention of the hunters, Marek's expression darkened. "Ah," he said, leaning back in his chair. Marek's voice dropped as he began to recount the tale. Long ago, before this village even existed, there was a thriving community where the forest now stands. The people lived in harmony with the land, but their prosperity attracted envy from neighboring kingdoms. War broke out, and the village was destroyed. Those who survived the attack were left broken, their spirits filled with hatred and despair. He paused, his eyes narrowing. They turned to the forest for refuge, but the forest was not what it seemed. It was a place where sorrow and rage festered, and the survivors' emotions gave birth to the first shadow hunters. These beings were not fully human, nor fully spirit. They were creatures of pure darkness, born from the pain of those who had lost everything. Elaina shivered as she listened. "But why do they haunt us now?" "Because the curse of the shadow hunters is tied to the forest," Merrick said, "and the forest is tied to this village. Over the centuries, the forest grew hungrier. It began to lure the lost and the grieving, feeding on their despair to create more hunters." Marek's gaze shifted to the lantern in Elena's hands. "That lantern," he said, his voice softer now. "It's no ordinary light." Elaina looked down at the lantern, its glass panels worn and scratched but still intact. "It was my father's," she said. "He always kept it lit when he went near the forest." "That's because your father knew its power," Merrick said. "The light it holds isn't just fire. It's an old magic, a gift from the forest itself, before it was corrupted. The light can repel the shadows, but it can't destroy them. That's why the hunters fear it, but still seek it. They want to extinguish the last bit of hope it represents." Elena's grip tightened on the lantern. "So you're saying it's a weapon?" "In a way," Merrick said. "But be warned, using it will draw the attention of the forest. And the hunters won't stop until they've claimed you." That night, back at their home, Kale woke with a start, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "They were here," he whispered, clutching Elena's arm. "The hunters. They were outside the window." Elaina rushed to check, but there was nothing but the stillness of the night. Yet Kale's fear was real, his trembling hands and tear-streaked face proof of what he had seen. "They said they're coming back for me," he said, his voice breaking. And for you, Elena's resolve hardened. She couldn't wait any longer. The hunters weren't just a threat to Kale, they were a threat to the entire village. She needed to go back into the forest to face the shadow hunters and uncover the truth. The next day, Elaina packed what little she could: food, water, and a lantern. Kale protested, begging her not to go, but she knelt in front of him and took his hands in hers. "I have to do this," she said. "If I don't, they'll never leave us alone. I'll be back, I promise." Kale's lip quivered, but he nodded. "Be careful," he said, "and don't let the light go out." Elaina hugged him tightly, then turned and walked toward the edge of the forest. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. But she didn't hesitate. This time, she wasn't running from the shadows. She was going to confront them.